Yeah, yeah!
Oh!
Wow!
Yeah, yeah! Yay! Wow!
The overall finding that's important for us is that the singers performing and teaching the rough vocal effects, they were all rated as healthy by these 3 ENT doctors. They were all rated as healthy by the 4 speech therapists in terms of the sound, and their self-perceived vocal health improved in the period. Basically, they perform rough vocal effects, they teach rough vocal effects without any damage.
Hi, Aaron Perry here. Welcome back to RockVox. Today we are going to be talking about rock singing and if it's inherently dangerous to your vocal health.
And Ivan Mihaljevic here. As we know, many vocal coaches claim that belting, high larynx, rough singing are dangerous. So, on the other hand, we know a lot of singers have been using those sounds for long years and have had long and successful careers. What kind of sounds are we talking about? Just to give an example, I'm going to go with the Pain of Salvation example. I wanna taste it all. I wanna falter and fall. You know, these rough sounds with vocal effects that help us get these really aggressive sounds or, you know, strong emotions out. It could also be devotion or something like that. So, we're going to have a little bit of a chat today, and we have a special guest with us, a vocal scientist who actually just looked into some of these things.
Yes, sometimes it can be easy to get the impression that singing with a bit of rasp or a little bit of roughness in the sound of your voice can actually cause you to get vocally tired. Meaning that when you try and do these things, it can actually make you feel tired at some point. It's usually because there's something technical happening that you're not being careful about, that you're not paying attention to. The way I learned distortion was from watching and listening to Freddie Mercury and singing a lot of Queen songs. Freddie Mercury would love to add distortion to sounds like lose, or he would start the beginning of a song with an which can be done in a controlled way, but depending on how your technique is, if you're not used to controlling your volume, for example, with this kind of a vowel, like an oo vowel, and you use distortion, it can actually get too loud, and then you really will start to notice constrictions around here. This is what was happening to me in my case, and once I learned more about how to control my volume through CVT, these problems with getting tired while using distortion just evaporated. They just disappeared.
So for me, learning distortion, how I originally did it before ever learning about CVT. With CVT, I learned about so many other great effects I can add. But distortion, I learned it basically when I was 15, playing with my band and trying to, cover those James Hetfield Metallica vocals, copying his sounds, basically. But then, I went to my first singing teacher, who was a classical teacher, and the first thing she did was basically, tell me, no, you can't do that. We gotta, get you off that horrible distortion sound. So, and
sounds familiar, Ivan. This sounds familiar to me too.
I was a good student, so I obeyed. So, I was thinking that maybe I can somehow make that work. Although all my friends, when they came to our gigs at the time, they were like, yeah, I understand what she means, but, it sounded cooler before. The issue is that most vocal methods don't teach techniques for using rough vocal effects, despite the fact that they're widespread in modern music. And not just rough vocal effects, also metallic singing, also higher larynx singing, which is all something that we hear very often in rock and metal styles.
Not just the also falsetto. Actually, training a very high falsetto was actually forbidden by my vocal coach. He was like, no, you don't need to make sounds like that. That will ruin your voice, he would tell me. And the funny thing is, that was around the time that the Darkness were actually just coming on the scene. So, yeah.
Yeah. I don't remember anything about falsetto with my vocal coach back then. I didn't work on a lot of falsetto with her. But I do remember, that was one of the things that I was really good at starting out, just getting, the powerful, loud, ow! Sound out. That kind of just worked intuitively for me. But anyway, there's this new study out in Journal of Voice, which is one of the most prestigious vocal science publications out there, probably the most prestigious. And it's looking at the health of singers, professional singers, using rough vocal effects, using high larynx, using metallic sounds over a period of 14 years. And we're so lucky to have here with us Mathias, who is a PhD vocal scientist who actually performed that study and wrote the paper on it. So please welcome Mathias. Hi, Mathias, and welcome to Rockvox. We're so excited to have you here. And before getting into all the details about this new paper, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Mathias. I am a voice scientist. I do my job mainly looking at people's voices for scientific purposes, as well as a singing teacher.
Can you tell us a bit about this recent paper that just got published? Who are the other authors? How was it carried out? And maybe also where it was published?
Of course. So this is what's called a longitudinal health study, which basically just means that it's a study that's carried out over a long period of time, looking at people's vocal health, their voices, how they're doing. So we were a team of researchers, including what's called a highly specialist speech and language therapist, basically someone who's trained specifically in voice health for language therapy. Then we had 2 laryngologists or ENT doctors, Catherine and then myself. So we were a research team, and we were doing this study with medical equipment provided by Olympus and what's called laryngograph or EGG people. And in the study, we have 3 ENT doctors or laryngologists assessing the laryngeal health of singers, professional singers, as well as 4 speech and language therapists looking at the singers' voices in terms of how they sound in audio. And the cool thing is they all look good.
Nice. So if, you look at some YouTube info or even talk to a vocal coach, a classical vocal coach in person, you will hear a lot of, general beliefs about loud singing and metallic singing and rough vocal effects being dangerous. So what do you think? How did those beliefs come to be?
Yeah, I think you're very right. It's a kind of anecdotal thing in our field, right? I think we have to recognize that the field of voice is a relatively young scientific field. It's also a field of research where the most published studies focus on classical singing, or here I mean Western operatic voice use. And there aren't that many studies performed that look at other styles, such as pop, rock, heavy metal, all kinds of genres. Luckily more are coming, but not that many. And with this in mind, we can imagine that if you're trained classically, and then you hear these very different sounds being used in other styles, they'll think this is not correct. It's not the right way to use the voice. And that's because they are understanding vocal function through the lens of classical is the only, or classical is the right way. And I think with this type of thinking in mind, rough and metallic sounding notes are very different from what they've been trained with. And that can kind of foster a bias against them maybe, or an not so understanding at least bias against them. I think we write in the paper somewhere that these types of sounds, and I mean here the rough vocal effects, they may sound dangerous or straining to an unfamiliar ear because they haven't been exposed to them before. They haven't learned about them or how they use and how they work. So I think it's mostly a listener bias than actual physiological evidence that the bit feeds into this kind of dangerous myth, so to say. And then, of course, there are also these anecdotal people trying things out, like, and then it hurts a little bit, and they go like, oh, this is really unhealthy. And then they generalize to the entire population of singing that this shouldn't be done. As scientists, we try to not generalize from one instance to the entire population, so we try to be wary of that. And we may, as singers or teachers, then get this entirely wrong. That it's not actually the sound hurting us, it's our technique for the sound that's hurting us. We simply didn't have the appropriate or the adequate technique for that sound just yet. I think if we look at the studies that are done on vocal effects, all singers that have been part of those studies, they look healthy.
Okay, which is something that I wanted to ask now. Like we were talking about, people thinking that it was unhealthy because of this or that. But has there been any scientific documentation about the risks of rough effects or high larynx positions, which is something some singing teachers often warn about, while others actually teach it as a viable tool for helping getting certain sounds, or just metallic singing in general?
Yeah, so there have been some studies looking at the physiology and the acoustics of rough vocal effects. Not that many, sadly, because it's not that big part of the field yet. More coming, luckily. So we have, as you know, some papers published on CVT, the CVT approach to rough vocal effects. There's also been a paper by a quite well-known scientist called Johann Sumberg. He did a study on what's called dist singing, basically a ventricular fold kind of involvement, so distortion in CVT terms. There's a German group of researchers that also did a study with a single male participant. They looked also at vocal effects from a CVT framework. And then also, I think, a study done by Ingo Tietze in the US, where he looks at ventricular fold vibrations as a part of a noisy voice source. And then some studies done on tuba, which is like a Mongolian throat singing style that involves the ventricular folds vibrating. So all these studies are looking at these notes, or these 5 studies look at these types of rough noises. Interestingly, all the singers that are part of these studies report healthy-looking larynges. They have no injury, no particular issues. They sing these things as part of their repertoire on stage, which sometimes puzzles the researchers. But at the same time, we also know from studies of vocal health in singers in general, so all singers here, including classical singers, that we use our voices more as singers than the general population would. We are also, as singers, more sensitive to changes in our voices, so even small fluctuations in our voice will impact our singing. So, in general, singers are at a higher risk of vocal injury because they use their voices more. Let's say they're doing 8 shows a week, like if they're on Broadway, no? That is not because of the vocal effect or because they sing loud or because they sing with metallic sounds. They just use their voices way more than the general person would, so they have a higher risk of getting an injury if they do it wrong. We also know from studies of people like patients in hospitals that have what's called MTD or dysphonia, which is like a speech pathology of roughness in their voice or like hoarseness in their voice, that some of these metallic sounds that we know are healthy from these studies, they share some similarities in how they look on a camera, if we put a camera down people's noses. So these bright, loud sounds, they have what's called an increased narrowing or constriction, if you will, necessary constriction, if you will. They also have a higher larynx, as you mentioned. We have a study that looked at particularly these patients compared to singers who use these strategies to look at, are they the same? Are they equally unhealthy? And what they find is quite interesting. They find that patients in hospitals or patients in clinics, voice clinics, they do that narrowing, but they do it all over the place. And they do it rather uncontrollably as a way to compensate for something wrong with their voice. Whereas singers are using a very specific type of narrowing, which is only done in the epilaryngeal tube, which is very low in the larynx, quite close to the vocal folds. And they do what's called a megaphone-shaped larynx, where they narrow down here but wide up here, which causes kind of an amplification like a speaker, like a megaphone you can hold in your hand. So it sounds louder and has this very clear metallic sound to it. This is not what's done by these patients. So this is how the singers do it healthily, with a controlled way, where the patients, they do it unhealthily and they need treatment as part of their problem.
As you're an authorized CVT teacher, as Aaron and I are as well, if we put the science aside for a second, you've
Sure.
obviously had a lot of experience both singing with effects and teaching the effects and the metallic sounds and all of that. So did you have any personal experience that might suggest that these forms of singing were or weren't damaging or unhealthy?
It's a good question. So if I'm completely honest, way before my training, when I was just singing, I didn't attempt these vocal effects very much. But when I tried to do like loud sounds, when I tried to do just like noises with my voice, it wouldn't feel that comfortable actually. Now I know why that is the case, because now I'm trained. But back then I did feel there was a bit of, my technique was lacking for the sounds, no? Then I was singing, of course, a lot, but I wasn't singing with necessarily good trained technique. As I then started my studies to be a singing teacher, an authorized CVT teacher, as well as a singer, I found out, of course, that, okay, I was lacking the tools. I didn't have the proper support. I didn't have the control of the phonation I was doing. I didn't have the control of the sound color I was trying to produce. And then when I added the effects, I tried to force it out, so I didn't do it with the right setting. So, of course, that makes sense why it wasn't that comfortable. Now that I've trained, and as part of our training to become authorized CVT teachers, we do both train classical as well as heavy metal or rock sounds and rough sounds. So we have to do both as part of our training. And now I can do both without any problems. And when I sing myself now, I still involve the vocal effects. I sing gospel. I've sung gospel for many years. So I would include it as part of my expression as a gospel soloist, where it's often used. So now, no problems at all.
Awesome. Could you, I think this might be a good point to maybe give us some examples of what that sounds like, all these effects we're talking about.
Yeah, of course. I think a very well-known example would be Louis Armstrong. People know his voice quite distinctively. He had this kind of rolly sound. We'd call that a growl in CVT. It would sound something like, "Hey, sea trees," this kind of rolly, kind of dark Kermit sound. I wouldn't use it quite that way in my singing. I would use it mainly at the beginning of a note. So I might go, "Oh Lord." So I do a little growl at the beginning into a higher note with a little ornamentation on the way down, just for fun, part of the style, right? That's one example of a growl. People may also know the rattle, which is a slightly more open setting of vocal effects. So it's also rolly, but not as dark. If you know Gavin DeGraw, he sings something like, "I don't want to be," this kind of in the beginning. That would be called a rattle. So it's still rolly, but it's brighter and more noisy. And then if you listen to heavy metal genres, you might hear the kind of very dark, demonic, grunty kinds of things. And these are all examples of the types of vocal effects that we can use with the voice in a healthy way. I'm perfectly fine. This feels comfortable because I'm applying the right technique for it.
Awesome. How did the idea for this study that we're talking about come to be?
So the study is actually part of a larger project that is focused on documenting laryngeal setups, or the way people use their voices in all kinds of singing. And because we had singers who had initially been part of the study back in 2007, they had all been endoscoped. They'd all been looked at with these cameras in their noses. We could see how they're using these vocal effects, how they did them. They came back for this new study, so we had the opportunity then to look at them one more time to see how they've developed, what had happened in the meantime. So it's called a retrospective study because we are looking at the data set from back in the day, comparing it to what's now happening, today's data set, or 2019-20. when the study was done. So we're looking at the changes between these two time intervals with 14 years between them. And because we know that this literature is quite scarce, there's not that much research done on this, we thought this is a golden opportunity for us to look at these fantastic voice specialists, have them look at these really good professional singers, and see what their voices look like and how they've developed in that period.
Awesome. And what methods were used to determine this?
So as I mentioned, we do what's basically a camera through people's noses. It's called, in fancy speak, video nasoendoscopy, or video through the nose endoscopy. So it's done with what's called a flexible scope. And this scope goes through the nose into the larynx, and it sits above the vocal folds. And then it flashes a light. If you go to this, like a disco, you see this stroboscopic kind of light, and it flashes so you move like a robot. The same thing can be done inside the voice in synchronization with the vocal folds. Just look at how they're vibrating very nicely. So this we did together, that kind of endoscopy, with what's called an EGG, or electroglotography. It looks at the vocal folds from a little electrode here placed on the voice, measures the closure of the vocal folds. And then we did assessments of that data set with what's called the RFS, or the reflux finding score, as well as what's called the stroboscopy rating scale, or the SRS. And these are medical assessment forms that are usually used to look at people's health when they're in hospital. So we use them to check out the health of these singers from a medical point of view. We also had these speech therapists who are very good at rating perceptual assessments of people's voices by hearing them, by what's called a GRABAS, or a GRBAS, which is a well-known way of documenting the sound of people's voices, particularly looking at dysphonia. And then, of course, as you mentioned, we had this SVHI, or what's called a Singing Voice Handicap Index, which basically is a questionnaire people fill in that tells us about how they see their voices, how their voices are doing when they are singing, how they perceive their voices on stage, when they're off stage, if it's doing well, if they feel any discomfort, these types of things. So all this went into this kind of triangulation of the data set of vocal health.
That's so cool. And of course, the most interesting bit about all of that is, what were the results? What were your findings? What were your conclusions from those results?
Yeah. So as you can imagine, there's quite a bit of results based on all these different measures. But I think the overall finding that's important for us is that the singers performing and teaching the rough vocal effects, they were all rated as healthy by these 3 ENT doctors. They were all rated as healthy by the 4 speech therapists in terms of the sound, and their self-perceived vocal health improved in the period. So there's no change in the vocal function, there's no damage in the vocal function, and they self-perceived as being better. Basically, they perform rough vocal effects, they teach rough vocal effects without any damage.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and then I'm quite happy with that, to be honest. I think it's really cool that we finally see it, which is nice. And I think the main conclusion from that for us as teachers, as singers, as voice professionals, is that it's not dangerous to sing with rough vocal effects if performed with good technique, just like any singing should be. And this is an important point. We can sing all styles wrong. We can sing them all with unhealthy technique, getting ourselves into trouble. And I would say we can liken it to becoming or being like an athlete, performing at a very high level. If we go out on court or into the arena or into the swimming pool with poor technique, we're quite likely to get injured, simply because what we're doing, we haven't trained for. We don't know how to do it in a healthy way. But if we train good technique for what we want to do, we can perform at a high athletic level without any injury. And I would say, imagine running a marathon with no training for it. I imagine it's going to be difficult, and most likely the day afterwards we're going to feel very sore, most likely some pains here and there in the body, if not an actual injury from doing it. So we have to train for a marathon to have the right technique, to be in the right physical shape, just as we have to train to have the right technique for the sounds and the right stamina for those types of sounds.
Cool. Are you planning another follow-up after some time has passed with those same people? To see how it has developed over further time?
So at the moment, we are not planning a specific project focused on vocal health of the rough vocal effects, because we already have done that study. But we are doing studies, as we always do with professional singers. And if some of these people are then part of those studies, we will definitely invite them for an endoscopy to see how the vocal function is doing and assessing their vocal health in general. And that we always report this as part of our studies. It's quite important for us as authors, the entire author group, that we always report the vocal health of the population that we study, because it tells the reader something about if the person that we looked at represents who they are. Something who's healthy, somebody who's doing what they're doing in a good way. Otherwise, we can rely on the findings to be informative for how we should be doing things.
So we have concluded basically that rough vocal effects can be done safely, can be trained safely, can be taught safely with the right technique. But we all know that of course, that we can wreck our voices with poor technique. So can you name some factors that are actually abusive to the voice?
Yeah, you're quite right. I would say there are a few factors that can impact our health or be considered abusive. I think you mentioned the first one that's most important, poor technique. So attempting any sound with inadequate technique for that sound can cause us problems. And that relates to any genre, any style, any kind of context for musical performance. And I would use an image to say you want to go on stage and perform Puccini opera on like an operatic stage without any vocal training. Your chances of getting an injury trying to perform that sound loudly and filling that theater is quite high, as well as also upsetting the audience most likely. So this idea of trying to push the volume or push the sound out of our voice can be a problem, or pushing for the high notes or forcing for the high notes. These can be problematic if we don't rely on good technique for them. Singers that haven't trained for that type of style, type of singing, would tend to force out air or constrict way too much, or they'll try to really push in their bodies. And these are kind of unhelpful strategies for getting a louder sound. What we need to do for that type of loudness would be controlled narrowings in very specific parts of the vocal tract to make those types of sounds healthily, which doesn't then have that much increase of effort, because we do it with an adequate technique for it. So I think there are really many things we can do wrong with poor vocal technique, and we can do lots of things right if we address that with adequate technique. That's a good place to start in terms of vocal abuse. And then there are a few things to consider in terms of factors that might impact our vocal health, such as smoking. If we are smokers, I'm not, but if we were, smoking can lead to something called Rehnquist's edema, which is basically irreversible damage to the mucosa of the vocal folds. It leads to a perceived hoarseness, and typical problems also include like unintentional breathiness or difficulty in reaching the high notes. And as said, it can't be resolved because it's on the vocal fold mucosa and it's sit there as a little swelling that we can't get rid of. And that's a problem, of course. Other issues might be something like allergies or lack of sleep, dehydration. These all contribute to our general health in the body, which then, of course, also impacts the voice. Particularly, I think untreated allergies can be a problem for singers because it can lead to unintentional hoarseness, some dryness, some swelling, some irritation, or even increased production of mucus. And these can all influence how we feel our voice. And then we may start adapting or maladapting our vocal function to that, our technique, and we may end up in trouble because of the poor technique, not the allergy itself. So these are all contributing factors that can really impact our vocal health.
And I'd just like to circle back and clarify a bit, which you did already state, but just the bit about the volume.
Yeah.
It's important to say that it's not necessarily unhealthy to sing loudly.
No.
It's just unhealthy to sing loudly with the incorrect technique that doesn't work for those kinds of volumes, because we can indeed get very loud in a safe manner, as you would know, because Mathias is actually a very loud singer, or can be a very loud singer, doesn't have to be. And also Aaron and me were pretty loud ourselves.
Yeah, that's a good point. Technique is important, I think, for anything we want to do. If we apply techniques for being quiet to singing loudly, or techniques for being very loud to quiet singing, those don't match very well because it's different vocal functions, different subglottic pressures, different transglottic airflows, different resonance features. All this stuff impacts the health. So we really have to know what sound we want and know how to make that sound in a healthy way.
Cool. So looking into the future, what have you got lined up? Have you got any further investigative studies in plan covering the topics of vocal health? Maybe something else that you would like to point out?
We haven't planned a study for now of vocal health again, but we always document, as I mentioned, the health of any singers that are part of our research projects. These days, we are looking more towards unhealth. So particularly unhealthy voices for people who don't sing, but for people who speak. So let's say you have a problem of like hoarseness in the speaking voice as a patient in the hospital, but it's called dysphonia for most people, or like a hoarse speaking voice. We're looking at these types of patients and how we can come from a CVT perspective and might aid in the rehabilitation of these voices towards improved or even completely healthy vocal function again. So we're looking at vocal health, but mainly how to restore vocal health in unhealthy patients.
Cool. And when can we expect that?
So we are currently collecting the data set for some of these patients. So I imagine we'll have some preliminary findings for the autumn and potentially something to present in the autumn or the spring. So hopefully soon.
So thank you very much for joining us on our channel. It's been a pleasure having you here. We hope to have you again at some point. And is there anything else you would like to add? And if people want to contact you, where can they contact you? Stuff like that.
Sure. So I would just say, if you are a singer, starting out with these types of sounds, seek out help for good vocal technique, either from a teacher or look at the apps that are published on these. We have apps available for smartphones and tablets. The apps contain sound examples, good exercises, tricks for finding these sounds. The app is called Complete Vocal Technique. I think it's worth checking out if you're trying it out.
And just to interject, we actually have links below.
That's perfect.
To the apps.
That's awesome. And then if you are a nerd like me and you want to get in touch about the papers and the research, you can always pop me an email at matthias@shout.dk, and I'm happy to answer questions about the research that we have and what's ongoing at the Institute.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, as we can see, all of these rough-sounding rock vocal effects can be performed safely with the correct technique. If you need help with that technique, you can learn these sounds using CVT with myself or with Ivan. Feel free to contact us using the contact details below. If you've enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Feel free to write in the comments below suggestions that you might have for future videos, subjects that we can address. And yeah. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.